Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan, and recently I set out to find the greatest year in the history of science fiction. So I went through almost 100 years of sci-fi, selected the top 5 books from each of them, and made those years compete against each other in a 5v5 tournament in order to bring you guys the top 3 years which I think represent the pinnacle of sci-fi. So without further ado, here's your bronze medalist, 1969, represented by a team of Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, Ubik by Philip K. Dick, Dune Messiah by Frank Herbert, The Andromeda Strain by Michael Crichton, and The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. So let's kick things off with my favorite writer of all time, Kurt Vonnegut, and possibly his most well-known work, Slaughterhouse-Five, which features a World War II soldier called Billy Pilgrim that comes unstuck in time. So this book deals with some pretty heavy themes to do with war and technology and post-traumatic stress, and it does so in kind of an absurd way that uses some fun sci-fi tropes, including aliens and time travel, and he's able to connect these things in a way that, to me, found comedic but also personal and poignant. Kurt Vonnegut is the type of writer where you can pick him up and read him, and you just think, yeah, this guy gets it. Moving on to another one of my favorite writers, we have Philip K. Dick and his book Ubik, which is set in an interesting world with psychics and anti-psychics, and we follow a corporate espionage plot, and as we go along it, the nature of reality starts to shift. Things become a little unclear, it's a little surreal, it's a little trippy, and it's very uniquely Philip K. Dick. It's also a book that I think really pays off in the second half, as we start to get little clues, some red herrings, and as the puzzle pieces fall into place, this book really just blew me away. You might still be pondering things afterwards, you might still have some questions, but I found it to be very satisfying indeed. Then next up we have Dune Messiah by Frank Herbert, which I really enjoyed. A little bit less than the first book, Dune, but still a great book overall, as it takes, I think, some of the strengths of Dune, like its world building and its themes, and expands on them. I liked getting to learn a little bit more about the universe, what happened after the events of Dune, even though there is a bit of a time jump between the two books. And I think it really delivers on the theme of leaders, people in positions of power, messianic figures, in a very interesting way, because it explores in both a micro way, the experience of what it's like to actually be that individual person, as well as the macro impacts, the effects that they can have. Next up, for Team 1969, we have The Andromeda Strain by Michael Crichton. And this book follows the story of the release of a potential virus of an unknown source that could have some pretty disastrous consequences. And what's fun about this book is it kind of takes the trope of there being some kind of disaster or emergency where we have people on the ground and then the scientists back at the base trying to figure out what's going on, how they can help them work as a team to solve this issue. And what this book does is, how about we just get rid of this stuff and focus on the nerds? This book really dives into the science. The scientists are the main characters, they are the heroes, and this might not work for everyone, but if you are someone that enjoys harder sci-fi, you want to dive into the techno aspects of the techno thriller, then I think you might enjoy The Andromeda Strain. In a lot of Crichton books, the character writing isn't necessarily the best. He usually has some pretty punchable characters, even including the children, and I'm not saying I would ever actually punch a child, but I might feed them to a dinosaur. In this book, I didn't find that to be as the case as much, because the characters were just pretty flat. I didn't really want to punch them, but I didn't really care about them at all either, so that's not really a plus, but for Crichton standards, maybe it is a plus. The characters didn't really bother me. I was mostly invested in the story and the science. And lastly, we have The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin, which follows the story of an emissary to an alien planet which is mostly covered in ice and snow. So I think this book does a good job of exploring some sociological themes to do with culture and gender and identity, but for me the plotting was just a little bit slow. I didn't quite connect to the story and the characters as much as I wanted to. And I think this book would have been quite groundbreaking and revolutionary at the time it was released, although for a modern reader, I'm not sure it would seem quite as fresh. But still, either way, I think it is a very influential and an important book for the science fiction genre. So that was a pretty stacked roster. What could possibly have beaten it? Well, in the silver medal position, we have 1953, being represented by Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke, More Than Human by Theodore Sturgeon, Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, Second Foundation by Isaac Asimov, and The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester. Childhood's End is one of my favorite books of all time, the premise for which is that a number of alien spaceships suddenly appear above a number of major cities around Earth. Why are they here? What do they want? What does this mean for the future of humanity? The book is split into 3 parts, each more mind-blowing than the last. I think my favorite thing about Childhood's End is how it simultaneously makes me feel incomprehensibly tiny and insignificant, while also being connected to absolutely everyone and everything else in the universe. Moving on to More Than Human by Theodore Sturgeon, we have a story that follows some characters with some disabilities as well as some supernatural abilities. And again, this is a book that is told in 3 parts, but in More Than Human, these parts feel a little bit disjointed. Each of them kind of feels like a reset in the story, and there's that moment where you're like, where are you going with this, Sturgeon? How are you going to be able to tie these things together? Have no fear, he does, masterfully. The way he weaves these storylines and characters together not only created a satisfying narrative, but something that I was really personally affected by. I think Sturgeon is a powerful writer, a poetic writer, and I hope more people try More Than Human. Stepping up next for Team 1953, we have Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, which is a classic dystopian novel in a future world in which firefighters don't exist to put out fires, but rather exist to burn books. And speaking of powerful and poetic writers, Ray Bradbury might just be the best prose writer in all of science fiction. I know he isn't exclusively a science fiction writer, but we need to claim him. We need to fight back against the people that say classic sci-fi writing is dry, because Bradbury might be one of the most eloquent writers to put pen to paper in order to describe themes that are still relevant today. And next up, we have Second Foundation by Isaac Asimov, another heavy hitter in the science fiction genre. This is the 3rd book in his original Foundation trilogy, which follows the story of Harry Seldon and his discipline of psychohistory, which he uses to try to avert a disaster, an impending disaster, thousands of years in the future. Now, I will be honest, I liked Foundation the most out of the original trilogy, but I did still enjoy Second Foundation, and I found the stories in this to be a satisfying and very clever conclusion to what he began with Foundation. And lastly, we have The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester, which asks the question, in a world policed by telepaths, how does one get away with murder? This book conceptually was very ambitious, and it even plays with the medium in terms of how it places the words on a page when representing telepathic communication. My only issue with this book was that anytime we had a chapter following the character of Ben Reich, I was totally hooked. I was totally intrigued by what was going on, and whenever we had a chapter following the detective Lincoln Powell, I was bored out of my mind. Sorry, Lincoln. Alright, just before we get to our gold medalist, here are 2 honourable mentions, with 1963 being represented by Cat's Cradle, Planet of the Apes, The Invincible, The Man Who Fell to Earth, and Waystation, as well as 2002 with Altered Carbon, Light, Shield's Ladder, Redemption Arc, and Metro 2033. So I love some of these books, and there's some big names on these lists, but I haven't read all of them, so I might have to come back to this list in the future once I have read all of these books and compare them, see if they can challenge some of my medalists, but for now, they are honorable mentions. So that brings us to first place, the gold medalist, what I consider to be the best year in the history of science fiction, 1985, being represented by Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card, Blood Music by Greg Bear, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, Contact by Carl Sagan, and Chapterhouse Dune by Frank Herbert. Starting off with Ender's Game, we follow the young Ender Wiggin as he is recruited to battle school in order to be trained up as a potential leader in order to fight against an intergalactic war against aliens. I think this is one of the classics in the genre that lives up to its reputation. I think it works well whether you are new to sci-fi or an experienced science fiction reader. Whether you are a young reader or you read this as an adult, there are different elements for you to explore and enjoy. I really enjoyed both the tactical elements that it dives into when it comes to the battles, as well as the philosophical elements that the characters are battling, and I think it has one of the best endings in all of science fiction. Moving on to Blood Music by Greg Bear, we have a great tale of man's hubris. We follow a character that tries to steal experimental research from a laboratory by injecting it into himself. I think this book does a great job of utilizing this trope that was popularized in works such as Frankenstein by Mary Shelley or Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton, and it's really fun going through that sort of first half of the book just thinking, oh, how is this all just going to go horribly wrong? and then it plays out in a way that I found to be both narratively satisfying and conceptually very interesting. Greg Bear introduced a couple of sci-fi concepts that I think about all the time after having finished reading it, which is one of the reasons this is my favorite genre. Next up, for the gold medal winning 1985, we have The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. And this is a dystopian novel that is set in a world following a second civil war, and where fertility rates are dropping, so women that are fertile are taken control of and used as handmaids. This is a dark novel, this is a depressing novel, and it tackles some pretty heavy themes to do with government and control and power and violence. But something I appreciated about this novel was that it didn't always just focus on these high-level themes. It dove into them through little moments, specific character moments, exploring the ways that individuals live and express themselves and interact with each other. And I thought that Margaret Atwood's observations were just so incredibly astute. The way that she would sort of unpack sort of the hidden meanings behind things, the way she would explain the way that particular people would act, I found to be incredibly revealing, and I really connected with this book, and I thought that Atwood was just such an intelligent writer that if you knew her in real life, you would be able to go to her and explain a situation, and she would help you break it down just because of those observational powers that I think come out through her writing. So next up we have Contact by Carl Sagan, and this is a first contact story in which a message is detected out in space. Where did it come from? Who did it come from? What does this message mean? And in this book we have characters that approach this problem from a scientific perspective and other characters that approach it from a religious perspective. And I thought this was a really interesting way to frame the book. We have these two ideas, and Sagan explores the ways in which they might seemingly contradict each other, but also the ways in which they can coexist. And the concepts revealed in this book I found to be incredibly thought-provoking and really influenced the way I think about potential first contact. And lastly, we have Chapterhouse Dune, the sixth and final book written by Frank Herbert in his Dune series. So I will be honest, I liked books 5 and 6 a little bit less than I enjoyed the first 4 books, but I still enjoyed this Dune series. Books 5 and 6, Heretics and Chapterhouse, kind of start a little bit of a new story arc, introduce some new characters, and if you were particularly interested in the Bene Gesserit aspects of the Dune series, then you might like Chapterhouse, because that is a focus of this book. Their aims, their goals, their philosophies is something that Chapterhouse really dives into. So, I know this is the second Dune book featured in this video that was not Dune. Well, Dune might be an MVP player, but this is a team game, and I think the rest of the 1965 roster might have let the team down, whereas 1985, that's a well-rounded roster. They got it done, they came together, and they won the gold medal. So there you go, those are my bronze, silver, and gold medalists. Let me know your favorite year of sci-fi of all time, and what your top 5 starting roster would be. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash or just gently click the subscribe button, and if you really enjoyed it, consider checking out the perks of becoming a Patreon member, where you can become one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs, like Nima and New Eden, Half-Ogre, Zakawe, and the gold medal Colin. And you can find more sci-fi content over here.